Snow had been falling over Ashen Creek settlement for 3 straight days, but the deepest cold arrived with the slam of the mill door shutting in front of Mara Whitlock. Since her husband died the previous spring, the young widow had taken on every odd job she could find around Edwin Crowther's flour mill. She swept sawdust, repaired sacks, cleaned storage rooms, and counted inventory. Anything that would earn her and her daughter a narrow space behind a plank wall to sleep. Everyone understood the arrangement was temporary. Even so, forcing a mother and her 8-year-old child out on the very morning a blizzard was preparing to swallow the valley felt less like a practical decision and more like a death sentence. Edwin stood beside a stack of flour sacks and spoke as if he were discussing weather instead of a family. There isn't enough food for everyone. Reverend Silas Bell stood nearby and called it a necessary decision. Around them, townspeople watched from porches and frosted windows. Nobody argued. Nobody stepped forward. Mara absorbed the verdict in silence. She did not beg. Having worked there long enough, she knew the mill was rotting from the inside out. Months earlier, she had warned that moisture was creeping through a section of the mill roof. Several flour stores were already absorbing damp air. Edwin dismissed the concern. The warning disappeared. The leak did not. A gust of wind rattled the mill doors. Mara glanced toward the darkening sky. How many hours before the storm reaches the valley? Her composure caught Edwin off guard. For a fleeting moment, he was left speechless, merely staring at her. Out in the snow-covered yard, 8-year-old Elsie Whitlock stood beside a mule and a shaggy brown dog. Both hands were wrapped around a small stoneware jar. It held the sourdough starter her father had kept alive for years. She held it more carefully than anything else they owned. Edwin Crowther disappeared into the mill and returned with what he considered a fair parting gift. 1 damp flour sack, a handful of dried potatoes, an old shovel with a cracked handle. He set them down carefully, almost expecting gratitude. None came. Mara lifted the sack and felt the weight shift. The flour inside had already begun to clump. Moisture had found its way in long ago. Snow skated across the frozen ground as Elsie led Juniper toward the road. Bramble followed close behind, stopping only once to glance back at the mill. The widow lingered for a moment longer. Her eyes moved to the roofline where warped boards sagged beneath a crust of ice. The same section she had warned Edwin about before autumn ended. The leak was still there. So was the silence around it. What settled deepest was not the loss of a room or a warm stove. It was the ease of it all. No shocked faces, no arguments, no one asking whether it was right. Elsie tightened her grip on the stoneware jar and looked up. "Do we still have a home?" For several seconds, only the wind answered. Then Mara adjusted the flour sack on her shoulder and started walking. Not yet. The road out of Ashen Creek narrowed as it climbed toward Bitterroot Cut. Juniper pulled steadily through fresh snow while Bramble ranged ahead, disappearing now and then among sagebrush drifts before returning to the trail. Elsie walked beside the mule, both hands still wrapped around the stoneware jar. Mara said little. Most of her attention was fixed on a memory. Years earlier, her husband had spent several evenings studying a weathered geological survey borrowed from a railroad crew. The map itself had been ordinary. What stayed with her was a note scribbled in the margin near a place called Black Furnace Ravine. Ground remains warmer than surrounding terrain. Possible geothermal influence. At the time, nobody cared. The remark never became a town discussion. It never appeared in a newspaper. It was simply a line of pencil on an old sheet of paper, yet Mara remembered exactly where it had been written. Ahead, the sky darkened another shade. Wind swept loose snow across the trail and erased their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the storm was gathering strength. Instead of searching for a road back, Mara kept moving toward a place most people had forgotten existed. The storm caught them before they reached the ravine. Wind shifted constantly across the mountains. Snow swept over the trail and erased their tracks almost as fast as they made them. Juniper slipped twice on hidden ice. Elsie stumbled more than once and eventually fell hard into a drift. When Mara helped her back to her feet, she noticed how pale the girl's fingers had become. Ahead, Bramble suddenly left the trail. The dog moved toward a rocky slope and began sniffing along the ground. Something there had caught his attention. Mara followed his movement and noticed an odd detail. Snow covered the hillside, just not as deeply. Thin patches exposed strips of stone beneath the white surface. A faint ribbon of vapor drifted upward and disappeared into the cold air. Mara looked from the slope to the darkening sky. For the first time since leaving Ashen Creek, she saw something that looked less like luck and more like a possibility. The rocky slope narrowed into a crack between two limestone walls. At first glance, it seemed too small to matter. Then they stepped inside. The wind weakened almost immediately. Snow became thinner. Bare ground appeared in scattered patches along the ravine floor. The passage twisted once, then opened into Black Furnace Ravine. Silence settled around them. Not complete silence. The storm still existed beyond the cliffs. Yet its voice seemed farther away. Mara eventually knelt beside an exposed section of soil. She removed a glove and pressed her fingers into the earth. It was cold. Winter cold. But it was not frozen solid. The soil crumbled instead of ringing hard beneath her touch. Behind her, Elsie waited quietly. Mara dug a little deeper and felt the same thing. The old note on her husband's map suddenly seemed far less forgotten than it had that morning. Black Furnace Ravine stretched farther than Mara expected. Instead of rushing deeper, she spent the remaining daylight studying it. The northern side drew her attention first. Snow melted faster there. Several patches of exposed ground felt slightly warmer than the rest. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would impress a crowd. Yet in winter, small differences mattered. A sandstone wall concealed something larger behind it. Working around the outcrop, she discovered a broad rock alcove recessed into the hillside. The floor remained mostly dry. Thin beads of moisture clung to sections of limestone above, suggesting warmth moving through hidden fractures below. One question still remained. Could the place breathe? As dusk approached, Mara gathered twigs and built a small fire near the alcove entrance. Both she and Elsie watched the smoke carefully. At first it rose straight upward. Then the gray ribbon bent. Instead of drifting back into their faces, it slid deeper into the darkness and disappeared. The draft was steady. The cave was pulling air through itself. Mara continued watching for another minute before adding more wood. Outside, the blizzard was beginning to close over the mountains. Inside, the smoke had already delivered its verdict. For the first time since leaving Ashen Creek, she allowed herself to believe they might still be alive when morning came. The first 48 hours disappeared into work. Black Furnace Ravine offered possibilities, but possibilities did not stop wind. They did not keep food dry. They did not create a place where a child could sleep through the night. Everything still had to be built. Mara started with stone. The alcove sat beneath a sandstone overhang, which meant part of the roof already existed. That saved time. Juniper hauled smaller rocks from the ravine floor, while Mara rolled larger pieces into position by hand. Some weighed enough to leave her shoulders aching long after sunset. A rough windbreak slowly took shape along the most exposed side of the alcove. Meanwhile, Elsie gathered dead branches trapped beneath ledges and juniper roots. Every armful mattered. Dry wood was becoming harder to find as fresh snow buried the valley. Bramble settled near the entrance whenever they worked. The dog rarely slept deeply. Any unfamiliar sound brought his head up at once. By the second afternoon, the shelter finally began to resemble something intentional. A raised sleeping platform was built from poles, stone supports, and salvaged brush. Keeping bedding off the ground would reduce heat loss and protect it from moisture. Nearby, Mara constructed a simple hanging rack from forked branches and cordage. Food could be stored above reach of rodents and away from damp pockets near the floor. None of it looked impressive. The walls were uneven. The platform creaked. The storage rack leaned slightly to one side. Yet each piece solved a problem that winter would gladly exploit. That night, the storm arrived in full force. Wind struck the cliffs hard enough to send snow swirling past the ravine entrance. Somewhere beyond the limestone walls, trails disappeared beneath fresh drifts. Routes back to Ashen Creek were vanishing one layer at a time. Inside the alcove, the small fire burned steadily. The windbreak held. The raised bed stayed dry. Warm air lingered longer than it had the night before. Long after Mara had fallen asleep, Elsie remained curled beneath a blanket with the stoneware jar tucked beside her. Morning came before she opened her eyes. It was the first uninterrupted night of sleep she had experienced since the day they were forced to leave home. The storm kept them busy, but it could not occupy every hour of daylight. On the third morning, Mara followed a narrow passage beyond the main alcove and discovered a second chamber deeper inside the cave. It was smaller, warmer, and surprisingly dry. More important, a thin crack in the ceiling allowed a shaft of sunlight to reach the floor for several hours each day. She stood there for a long time, watching the light move across the stone. A plan began forming. The shelter would become more than a place to sleep. It would become a system. The first part was obvious. Bread meant calories, warmth, and stability. The sourdough starter Elsie carried was too valuable to lose. The second part required patience. If the cave truly held a steady source of warmth, then a small winter garden might be possible. Along with the weathered map and the sourdough starter, her late husband had left behind a small leather pouch of cold-hardy seeds: winter rye, turnip, beet, and kale. He had once dreamed of cultivating his own plot, a dream that died with him the previous spring. When they were forced out of the mill, Mara had packed the pouch almost out of habit, clinging to the memory without ever expecting to plant them in the freezing cold. But now, beneath this fragile shaft of light, those seeds were no longer just keepsakes. Back in the main alcove, Mara sorted the flour sack Edwin had given her. The driest portion was sealed away for baking. The damaged flour was spread on cloth near the warmest section of rock, then sifted carefully to remove clumps and moisture. The work was slow. The reward was uncertain. Yet for the first time since leaving Ashen Creek, Mara was no longer just trying to endure the winter. She was planning how to build a life in the middle of it. Mara's first oven was built from good instinct and too little mass. She shaped clay around a low ring of stone, packed ash beneath it, and fed the fire slowly until the chamber seemed hot enough. The smell of dough changed the whole cave. Elsie sat close with the sourdough jar in her lap, watching as if the oven might answer every question at once. It did answer, just not kindly. When Mara pulled the loaf out, the crust was dark and split open. Smoke clung to the surface. Inside, the bread was heavy, wet, and raw near the center. 3 days of saved flour had gone into it. Elsie broke off a piece anyway and tried to chew through the soft middle. She managed 2 bites before lowering her hand. Mara studied the oven wall, then the ruined loaf. The fire had touched the bread. The heat had not stayed long enough to finish it. By morning, she was stacking more sandstone. The second oven grew heavier. Mara thickened the clay wall, added sandstone behind the fire chamber, and narrowed the mouth so heat would linger after the coals were pulled aside. While the new oven dried, she turned to the chamber with the ceiling fissure. The soil there needed help. Elsie carried leaf mold from the ravine floor. Mara mixed it with sand, crushed limestone, and a little clean ash. Into the first small bed went winter rye, turnip, beet, and kale. For 3 days, the bed looked promising. Then the turnip leaves softened. By the next morning, several had collapsed against the soil. A cold shine coated the limestone above them. Mara touched the wall and found moisture gathering there, then dripping down where the turnips had been planted. The warmth had fooled her. Temperature was only one part of the problem. The stone was breathing damp into the wrong place. She pulled the dead turnip starts one by one and laid them beside the bed. Elsie watched from the passage without speaking. Mara did not look away from the ruined row. This time, the failure had roots. Mara left the empty row untouched. Planting another batch of turnips immediately would have felt productive. It also would have repeated the same mistake. For the next 2 days, she studied the chamber instead. Each morning began with a walk through the garden bed before the fire was lit. Small stones marked damp spots where water gathered overnight. By afternoon, she tracked the narrow beam of sunlight that slipped through the ceiling fissure and crawled across the floor. Darkness revealed different clues. Moisture appeared where warmth met cold stone, and certain sections of the wall seemed wet long after the others had dried. Elsie helped by moving pebbles whenever she found fresh droplets. Patterns emerged. The trouble always started along the northeast edge of the growing bed. A thin drainage trench solved part of the problem. The rest required space. Mara cut willow branches from the ravine and built a light lattice several inches away from the limestone wall. Air could now move through the gap instead of allowing moisture to collect directly above the crops. Nothing changed overnight. The kale simply stopped getting worse. A few days later, the beet leaves regained some of their color. That was enough. The chamber had delivered another lesson. Warm ground could support growth, but warmth alone was not the system. Water, airflow, and stone were making decisions too. Standing beside the repaired bed, Mara finally understood what had happened. The failed turnips were not proof that the garden could not work. They were evidence that she had been measuring the wrong problem. The second batch of bread demanded more patience than the first. Mara fired the oven longer and allowed the sandstone to absorb heat deep beneath the surface. When the flames finally died down, she waited. The dough rested. The oven rested. Nothing was rushed. Dawn arrived on the 12th day. A steady wind pushed against the ravine outside while Mara crouched beside the oven and eased the loaf into the light. Its shape was uneven. One side had cracked during the bake. The crust carried scars from the heat. None of that mattered. This time the bread was fully cooked. Warm steam escaped through the split crust and drifted across the chamber. The smell reached Elsie before the sunlight did. She opened her eyes, sat up beneath her blanket, and followed the scent without saying a word. Bramble lifted his head from beside the oven and watched quietly. Mara cut the loaf on a flat stone. The larger piece went to her daughter. The smaller one stayed in her own hand. While winter continued its relentless assault on the cliffs beyond, a warm loaf of bread now existed right where frozen ground and empty promises were supposed to have won. Elsie closed her eyes after the first bite and held the piece carefully with both hands, as if warmth itself had become something that could be carried. A week after the first successful loaf, winter reminded Mara that one victory solved only one problem. An Arctic front swept across the mountains and buried the upper ridges beneath fresh snow. The cave remained livable. The warm ground still held its temperature. Water continued to flow where it had before. Yet the sourdough starter began to weaken. The change was subtle at first. The jar smelled right. The mixture looked healthy. But the dough stopped rising the way it should. Each batch moved slower than the last. Mara tested different locations throughout the shelter. Near the oven, near the sleeping platform, closer to the garden chamber. Nothing worked for long. Several days passed before she noticed the real culprit. The stone floor was drawing heat away during the coldest hours of the night. The starter never froze, but it lost just enough warmth to slow the living culture inside. The solution turned out to be simple once the problem was understood. She moved the jar beside a section of naturally warm limestone near the rear wall and wrapped it in an old wool blanket that had belonged to her husband. 2 mornings later, the starter became active again. Tiny bubbles returned. The dough responded. For a brief moment, Mara rested her hand on the stoneware jar. Losing bread would have been difficult. Losing that jar would have felt like losing something twice. As the weather settled, the garden finally began answering back. The kale moved first. Small leaves unfolded toward the shaft of light that entered through the ceiling fissure. A few days later, thin blades of winter rye pushed through the soil. The surviving beets followed more slowly, but they followed. Green appeared where winter insisted it should not exist. Mara widened the growing area one section at a time. Nothing happened quickly. Every addition required moving soil, improving drainage, and studying how moisture behaved around the stone. Elsie became part of the routine. She carried composted material from the ravine, helped press seeds into prepared rows, and checked the young plants each morning before breakfast. Bread and winter greens provided hope, but enduring the bitter cold required more than just carbohydrates. The body demanded protein. Repurposing scraps of old wire she had salvaged from the mill, Mara twisted them into simple snares. Guided by Bramble's keen nose, she set the traps along the narrow, snow-packed trails that snowshoe hares used beneath the sagebrush just outside the ravine. Every few days, the traps yielded a catch. The meat provided life-saving nourishment and fat. The bones were boiled down into a rich broth to soak their bread, while the pelts were stretched and dried to add a crucial layer of warmth to their sleeping platform. The chamber looked different now, not dramatic, not abundant, yet it no longer resembled an emergency shelter hidden inside a cave. Food was growing, bread was baking, the snares were providing, the systems were beginning to support one another. One afternoon, Elsie stopped beside the newest bed and stared at the patch of green for several seconds. Outside, the mountains remained white from horizon to horizon. She had not seen that color in weeks. The next problem arrived without warning. Late one afternoon, a mountain wind descended through Black Furnace Ravine from a direction Mara had never seen before. It did not follow the usual path between the limestone walls. Instead, it twisted through the upper rocks and dropped directly toward the alcove. Juniper felt it first. The mule jerked against its tether, snorted, and lunged sideways. A section of the newly reinforced windbreak absorbed the impact. Then it collapsed. Stone scraped against stone. Dust filled the air. Within minutes, another problem appeared. Smoke that normally drifted away from the living area began creeping back toward the sleeping platform. By sunset, the shelter smelled different. By midnight, the chamber was hazy. Elsie could not sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, another ribbon of smoke found its way through the darkness. Mara spent the entire night working by firelight. Part of the wall came down. Then another section. Several times she thought the fallen stones were the cause. They were not. Near dawn, she finally discovered the real issue. The rebuilt windbreak had become too effective. By blocking one airflow path, it had disrupted the natural draft moving through the alcove. The cave still wanted to breathe, but the new structure was forcing that air to take the wrong route. The failure had not come from the storm. It had come from a design decision. Mara dismantled part of the barrier and opened a narrow passage where air could move freely again. The result was immediate. The next plume of smoke rose, bent toward the rear of the cave, and disappeared into the darkness. Elsie watched it go from beneath a blanket. Outside, the wind continued to hammer the ravine. Inside, the shelter had survived another lesson. This one carried a familiar message. Sometimes the flaw was hidden inside the solution itself. Day 46 began like any other winter morning inside Black Furnace Ravine. The fire was burning low. Fresh dough rested beneath a cloth near the warm limestone wall. A thin beam of sunlight had just reached the garden chamber when Bramble suddenly lifted his head. The dog did not bark. That was what caught Mara's attention. He simply stood, ears forward, staring toward the ravine entrance. A moment later, distant footsteps echoed between the stone walls. Someone was approaching, not wandering, not hunting. Coming directly toward the shelter, Mara set down the basket she was carrying and listened. Outside, a man named Jonah Pike, the settlement's winter mail carrier and saddle repairman, was following a trail that should not have existed. Ashen Creek had assumed the widow was gone. Most believed the blizzard had settled the matter weeks ago. Jonah had not been so certain. Curiosity brought him into the ravine. The smell stopped him before the shelter came into view. Fresh bread. For several seconds, he simply stood in the cold air trying to understand what he was smelling. The scent grew stronger as he moved forward. Then, the alcove appeared. A stone oven sat near the rear wall. Dry firewood was stacked neatly beside it. Blankets covered a raised sleeping platform. Bundles of food hung from a storage rack overhead. Near the entrance, Juniper stood healthy and well-fed beneath a wind barrier built from stone and timber. None of that shocked him as much as the garden. Green leaves stretched upward beneath the shaft of sunlight falling through the ceiling fissure. Kale, young rye, beet greens, life, growing in the middle of winter. Jonah stepped into the chamber and slowly removed his gloves. His eyes moved from the oven to the crops, then to the warm walls surrounding them. The shelter felt impossible, not magical. Impossible in the way a solved problem often appears to people who never witness the work behind it. Elsie emerged from the garden chamber, carrying a small basket. Mara followed a moment later. Neither looked surprised to see another person. The surprise belonged entirely to Jonah. On a flat stone near the oven rested a loaf that had come out only a short time earlier. Steam still escaped from a crack along the crust. Jonah stared at it longer than he intended. Beyond the limestone gap, snow drifted relentlessly through the gray air, yet Jonah stood paralyzed, completely enveloped in the rich, warm scent of fresh yeast and defying life. The widow everyone expected to find frozen was standing beside a working oven. Jonah remained in the shelter for most of the afternoon. Eventually, the conversation turned back toward Ashen Creek. The news was not good. The flour stores were shrinking faster than expected. Moisture had spoiled more grain than anyone wanted to admit. Several families were stretching meals by adding boiled roots and whatever dried food remained from autumn. The community baking oven had developed a cracked chimney. Smoke leaked into the work area whenever the wind shifted. Children were eating less. Older residents struggled with hard rations that required more chewing than many could manage. As Jonah spoke, Mara listened without interrupting. She asked questions. How much flour remained? Which households were struggling most? Who had children? Who had elderly family members? The answers came one at a time. When he finished, silence settled across the chamber. The oven clicked softly as it cooled. Light from the ceiling fissure drifted across the rows of winter greens. Mara looked toward the garden, then toward the fresh loaf resting beside the hearth. Her decision arrived quietly. The first deliveries would go to the families with the greatest need. Bread, kale, beets, whatever the shelter could spare. Jonah nodded immediately. He already understood what she was offering. What surprised him was who appeared on the list. Several names belonged to people who had watched her leave Ashen Creek without saying a word. One belonged to a household that had supported Edwin's decision. Another belonged to a woman who had turned away when Mara needed help most. None of that changed the answer. The food would go anyway. By sunset, Jonah was helping prepare sacks for the journey back to town. The frozen peaks remained firmly in winter's grip, but deep within the glowing alcove, a new kind of system had taken root. It was no longer built only to keep 3 lives alive. Now it was preparing to carry a little warmth beyond the ravine. The arrangement settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Whenever weather allowed, Jonah Pike made the trip between Ashen Creek and Black Furnace Ravine. He carried letters when he had them, supplies when he could spare them, and returned with whatever the cave was able to produce. The system kept growing, loaf by loaf, row by row. The bread oven worked more reliably with each firing. Kale matured first. Beet greens followed. A second planting of turnips succeeded, where the first had failed. The rye advanced slowly but steadily beneath the filtered winter light. No one in town knew exactly where the food was coming from. Stories appeared before facts did. Some believed a trapper had discovered a hidden cache. Others claimed a rancher beyond the mountains was sending supplies in secret. A few insisted the rumors were nonsense altogether. Yet the food kept arriving. The deliveries came in plain sacks, without announcements or explanations. Children who had been losing weight began looking stronger. Several elderly residents survived cold spells that worried their families only weeks earlier. One evening, Jonah stopped at a small cabin on the edge of town. Inside, a boy who had spent weeks picking at every meal sat beside the stove, holding a still warm loaf. His mother watched quietly as he tore off another piece, then another. By the end of the meal, nothing remained except a few crumbs on the table. For the first time in a long while, The child had finished everything placed in front of him. The cave received no credit. The widow received no praise. For now, the results were traveling faster than the story behind them. The storm that finally broke Ashen Creek was the same storm many residents had feared all winter. For 2 days and 2 nights, wind hammered the settlement without mercy. Snow piled against buildings. Ice formed where rain should never have reached. Then, sometime before dawn, part of the main flour warehouse roof gave way. The damage spread quickly. Water found its way into storage. Flour absorbed moisture. Entire sections of the reserve became useless within days. At nearly the same time, the communal baking oven failed. A widening crack in the chimney disrupted the draft completely. Smoke rolled back into the workspace. Fires would not burn correctly. Baking slowed to a crawl. The town suddenly faced a question it could no longer avoid. Where had the bread been coming from? The answer arrived during a crowded meeting inside the church hall. Jonah Pike stood before the same people who had spent weeks inventing theories. Then he told them the truth. The bread, the vegetables, the winter greens, all of it came from Black Furnace Ravine, and all of it came from the hands of Mara Whitlock. Silence followed. Caleb Dorr, a carpenter who had spent most of the winter mocking earth-built shelters, stared at him. Edwin Crowther did not speak. Reverend Silas Bell seemed unable to find words. Around the room, faces shifted from confusion to disbelief. Most had expected Mara Whitlock to die before the first major blizzard ended. Instead, she had built a working shelter. She had grown food. She had baked bread. And while Ashen Creek struggled to feed itself, that same widow had quietly been helping feed them. Edwin lowered his eyes. Months earlier, Mara had warned him about moisture entering the flour stores through the damaged roof. The roof had remained. So had the leak. Now the warehouse stood partially ruined, and the consequences sat in plain view for everyone to see. At last, the story behind the bread could no longer remain hidden. A week after Jonah revealed the truth, a small group left Ashen Creek and climbed toward Black Furnace Ravine. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they had run out of explanations. Edwin Crowther walked near the front. Caleb Dorr followed beside him. Reverend Silas Bell said little during the journey. The ravine looked smaller than most had imagined. So did the shelter. There were no hidden machines, no buried treasure, no miracle waiting inside the limestone walls. What they found instead was work. Years of frontier history had taught the same lesson over and over again. Most successful systems appeared simple after they were finished. The difficult part was seeing the hundreds of decisions buried underneath them. Mara met the visitors near the alcove entrance. She did not seem surprised. Jonah had warned her they were coming. The group slowly moved through the shelter. Their eyes landed on details that would have meant nothing a few months earlier. The drainage trench running beside the growing beds. The willow lattice separating crops from damp limestone. The carefully arranged storage racks. The thermal oven built from clay, sandstone, and repeated corrections. The garden chamber drew the most attention. Rows of kale occupied one section, beets filled another. Young turnips grew where the first failed crop had once died. Winter rye stretched toward the shaft of sunlight, entering through the ceiling fissure. Nothing about it looked magical. Every part looked earned. Caleb spent several minutes studying the oven before finally speaking. "The draft stays steady?" Mara nodded. Then she showed him where the airflow entered, where it exited, and how one poorly placed barrier had nearly ruined the entire system. He listened carefully. For once, he was not offering advice. He was asking for it. A short time later, Edwin found himself standing beside the flour storage area. The sacks were elevated above the ground. Air moved around them. The warmest sections of the cave were used deliberately. "How did you keep the moisture away?" he asked. Mara explained the process. No lecture followed. No score was settled. She simply answered the question. The conversation moved on. Reverend Silas spent most of the visit in silence. The speeches that sounded convincing back in Ashen Creek felt strangely small inside a shelter built by observation, labor, and persistence. Outside, winter still controlled the mountains. Snow covered the ridges. Wind swept through the upper passes. Nothing about the season had become easier. Yet the evidence stood in front of everyone. The bread existed, the vegetables existed, the shelter existed. The people inside it were alive. Long before anyone arrived from town, the mountains had already delivered their verdict. Warm stone held heat. Proper drainage protected roots. Good airflow prevented smoke from returning. Bread baked when ovens stored enough energy. Mistakes produced consequences. Correct solutions produced results. Belief never entered the equation. Near sunset, the visitors began the walk back to Ashen Creek. No formal apologies were exchanged. None were necessary. Caleb carried new ideas home. Edwin carried uncomfortable truths. Others carried questions they should have asked months earlier. Back inside the alcove, the oven released a final wave of warmth as another loaf finished baking. Elsie lifted it carefully and placed it on a wooden rack to cool. Steam drifted upward through a crack in the crust. Beyond the ravine, winter remained exactly what it had always been. But nobody in Ashen Creek believed Mara Whitlock was going to die in it anymore.